In this video, I'm going to go over 5 tips that were game-changing for how I learned jazz so that you can benefit from them as well. When you're in the process of learning something like playing jazz, then a part of it is just hard work, and then there are these moments that really change the way you think about something and help you progress a lot faster. My name is Larsen, learn jazz, make music. When I started playing jazz, I spent months practicing before I could finally play a solo on 2 jazz standards. I chose to start with Stella by Starlight and There's No Greater Love, and both of those are pretty horrible choices for a beginner. Way too many chords and complicated progressions. Luckily, I was pretty stubborn, so I just kept on going until I could make my way through the song. This was before mobile phones and grunge was still hip, so there are no videos. You'll have to settle for a dramatic reenactment. At this point in time, I was barely able to improvise over the progression, and I had to work hard to find something to play on each of the chords, which is also what I focused on, and that had a very bad effect on how the solo sounded. Phrases didn't really connect. There was no longer story or development in it. This actually remained a problem for quite a long time. I did not find a way to fix it until more than a year later, when I was taught to play changes so that you were thinking of where you needed to go, what target notes to play towards. This way of thinking made the solos have a much more natural flow and made the melodies a lot stronger. And that is something that's very important with most things in music. Think ahead. Make sure you are ahead of where you're playing. So play towards the target notes, see the voice leading taking you to the next chord, or learn to read ahead if you're sight reading. It will make your life easier and make you sound better, especially in terms of soloing, if you combine it with the next tip that I'm going to cover. I have a video on how you can apply this to learning to solo over changes, and you can check that out. There's a link in the description. While I was studying in Copenhagen and playing jazz standards in the street, I also had the luck to go to a week-long Barry Harris workshop in The Hague at the conservatory. And one of the things that I took away from that is also a cornerstone in how I teach, and one thing that I think is really overlooked in learning jazz on the guitar. Usually when we think about arpeggios, then there are these position boxes that show us all the notes of, for instance, a minor 7 arpeggio in a given position. Now this way of learning them is good for being able to see the notes on the fretboard, but it almost completely fails at helping you learn how to incorporate them into your playing and use them to play jazz lines. There's a much better way to practice towards that. The exercise that Barry told me to practice was to play all the arpeggios in the scale, not as separate boxes that don't naturally connect to the rest of what you use when you're soloing. Most of the time, the chords will change, but the scale stays the same, and when you make lines, you're not only using arpeggios, so having them placed in the context of the scale will make a lot more sense. And working on this exercise also gives you something that's much closer to the way arpeggios are typically used in bebop-inspired lines, which is usually as a 1-octave melody, not as a complete position in several octaves. My most viewed video on the channel digs into this and how you can use it to make some great bebop-inspired lines. And you can check that out, there's a link in the video description. But you probably also want to check out the rest of the video, and especially the last tip, which is probably the answer and the advice that I give the most online. It is actually pretty simple, and you don't want to make it too complicated. In a way, I was lucky that I could read sheet music because of my classical lessons, because that helped me figure out some things from reading transcriptions that I would have had a hard time figuring out by ear in the beginning. One of the things that really fascinated me when I was starting to listen to Charlie Parker was how the solo would sound different from moment to moment. This was very different from what I was used to with most of the blues and rock solos that I'd been listening to, where most of the time everything stayed in one scale across the chords. Not really playing melodies that were following the changes that closely. In the beginning, playing simple and clear solos will help you really get that connection to the chords. And that may seem different from how you think about complicated jazz with extensions, alterations, and upper structure triads. But you want to hit those thirds and fifths and get that to make sense so that later you can choose to be vague or clear, depending on what you want in your solos. So keep it simple and make sure that you can hear the chords in your solo. The people I checked out before getting into jazz probably offered me a shortcut when it came to this. When you first start learning chords on the guitar, then everything is based on grips, which is a practical and visual way to learn chords. But when it comes to playing jazz harmony, then that approach is maybe not that useful. In jazz, connecting the chords across the bar line with both melody and voice leading is much more important. And you'll realize that the chord voicings are something that you can change and mess around with, something you can use creatively and get to fit together, turning them into beautiful music. This will open up your comping and your fretboard to a sea of possibilities and not just a few grips. Before I got into jazz, I was checking out a lot of Hendrix and Stevie Ray Vaughan, and both of these have more of an open way to work with them, which include improvising with the chords and not just playing the same voicings all the time. I already thought of chords as something you could change and move around, which in hindsight made the transition to jazz comping a lot easier, since that's exactly how that works. The last tip is probably the advice that I give the most as an answer online, and also the most effective way to learn jazz. But before we get to that, maybe you have another tip that really changed things for your playing, or you don't agree with any of this. Let me know about it in the comments. At the beginning of the video, I talked about how I spent a long time learning 2 songs that were actually a bit too difficult, and that in hindsight, being stubborn and powering through to get those 2 songs down, even if it sounded pretty badly, was very useful. One thing that I see very often, especially now that there's more jazz educational material available, is that it all stays too superficial. You practice some licks and exercises, but it doesn't really become a part of your playing, and maybe you don't even really focus on learning songs, and that's a huge mistake. Think of it like this: if you only learn a few things, but make sure to be able to use them on all the songs you know, then you'll sound better and play great solos on all those songs, which is pretty much everything you can play. If you learn something that you can't put to use on any songs, then what are you really spending time on? For me, learning those 2 songs and later spending a lot of time playing songs in the streets was a huge help in getting to use everything, and in that way, really getting better. That first song is worth really pushing through. And of course, if you want some help in getting through that, you can check out the Jazz Guitar Roadmap, which is about exactly that process of really getting a song down. With all the exercises that you're told to do and ways of learning very specific things, can also mean that you get a little bit detached from the actual music. Just like playing the songs is the way to really learn to use what you practice, then often it's a very good idea to also find the things to start practicing in the music that already exists. And of course, the way you do that is by transcribing solos. That way you get insight into what arpeggios go where, how they sound, and how to use them. This also helps you to not go down strange rabbit holes like using all the diatonic arpeggios on all the chords, or other strange, time-consuming, unrealistic goals that I've seen people waste time on. If you're new to transcribing solos and want some recommendations for great but easy solos to learn so that you can ease into it, then check out this video where 10 of my friends on YouTube recommend some really great jazz solos to check out that will boost your playing, your lines, and your phrasing.